Hello and welcome to the Cross to Bear podcast. My name is Phil Bear and not Blair. and I have a very special guest with me today. And we're going to be talking about the Gospels in general and kind of what he's up to these days so that my listeners can kind of become more familiar with him if they're not already. And also they can catch up on Mike and see what he's doing and be able to follow along with what he's doing. He's doing a lot of exciting work, and I highly recommend following him and paying attention to what he's doing. So, but first, I want to ask everyone who's listening to please like and share and subscribe to my channel if you would. And you can support my channel by going to philbear.org/support. So let me bring my guest on today. He is Mike Licona, and some of you may be familiar with him, and some of you may not. If you're not familiar with him, then that's your loss, and we'd like to remedy that situation. So, hello, Mike. How are you doing? And tell us what you've been up to lately.
Well, thanks, Phil. Thanks for having me on. It's good to be with you. My present research has been a lot of fun and refreshing. I debated Bart Ehrman back in November on the question, who wrote the Gospels? And in preparation for that debate, toward the end, I got thinking, there's a lot of question about who wrote the Gospels, and a lot of scholars don't think the traditional authors were involved. I had looked at the evidence for the authorship. I became persuaded that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, or I'm sorry, Mark, Luke, and John were the authors of those gospels, though, probably John had some help. And Matthew, I do think that he was behind that gospel, although I do think he had some help as well. But in terms of that authorship, these traditional authors either putting reed to papyrus or getting help, some of the objections that I were hearing were I got thinking, if we applied those same kind of criteria to the authorship of some other ancient sources, not source or documents, literature written around the same time, whom nobody really questions, you'd have to deny them as well if you applied the same kind of criteria to it. So I called that the parity principle, P-A-R-I-T-Y, parity principle. And that principle ensures fairness by comparing similar cases in a similar manner. So I addressed a number of Bart Ehrman's objections using the parity principle. So I decided after that debate, though, I'd really like to take that further and go a lot deeper in it. I had already done, extensive research into the pros and cons of the Gospels, the authorship of the Gospels. I do want to spend more time with John. I think I need to spend more time with John because John, there's a lot of really good Johannine specialists, and I need to become familiar with their arguments. They'll, like Paul Anderson, Alan Culpepper, and some others, they don't believe that John was the author. So I really want to give consideration to those. But I wanted to get more in depth with the parity principle, and that is by really getting into the actual case for authorship of, let's say, Plutarch's Lives, Suetonius's Lives of the 12 Caesars, Sallust's 3 Histories, maybe even Tacitus's Annals of Rome. And so this year, that's what I've been doing. I've spent a lot of time with Sallust, most time with Sallust. I'd already spent a bunch of time with Plutarch, but I did add to that this year, and I have spent some time with Suetonius, but I need to spend more time with Suetonius and Plutarch. So that's some of the stuff I'm doing. And ultimately, I really want to compare. So by putting together exhaustive cases for the literature attributed to those 3 authors, and then compare it with the evidence we have for the traditional authorship that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the Gospels, and then considering the arguments against what the traditional authorship of the Gospels, and could you apply those same kind of arguments to the, Suetonius, Plutarch, and Sallust and see what would happen? So I'm having a lot of fun with it. I'm finding it very fascinating. I haven't found, I mean, it might be out there, but I haven't found an exhaustive treatment of the authorship of any of those. Not an exhaustive. So it's been a lot of really interesting research that I've been doing and looking at all these ancient sources to see what they have to say about it. It's been fun.
Cool. Well, I've had a lot of conversations recently about the resurrection and the historical reliability of the Gospels in general.
Hmm.
And a question that constantly comes up is they say, Phil, why is the authorship of the Gospels important? Why is it important that we know who wrote the Gospels? Doesn't their history stand on its own in terms of its strong content? And so can't we rely on it even if we don't know who wrote it?
Well, I think it's a valid question. I know you're familiar with my argument for the resurrection, and I've become somewhat familiar with yours, and it seems like it's pretty good. Um, but the argument that I basically use for the resurrection of Jesus stems from Paul. And from Paul, you can get to the other disciples, the other apostles.
Right.
I don't even need the Gospels to make a case for the resurrection of Jesus. I can make what I think is a very strong case for the resurrection of Jesus without using the Gospels. So, in the sense of arguing for the resurrection of Jesus, no, the authorship of the Gospels is irrelevant to me because I don't even use them. But that's not to say that the authorship of the Gospels isn't important for some other things.
Right. Yeah, other
Um,
things are really what I was
yeah.
talking about
Oh, okay.
because a lot of these discussions they revolved around the resurrection, but they also revolved around just the historicity of the Gospels in a general sense. And so and I sometimes I I struggle a little bit by answering that question because it seems to me, and you can tell me if you agree with this, it seems to me that a lot of people, especially a lot of Christians, they struggle with the reliability of the Gospels because they struggle with the authorship problem.
Yeah.
And so I think that's one reason why the authorship problem is important. But I also try to encourage people to look at the fact that there are a lot of ancient historical records that most historians consider reliable, but they have no idea who wrote them. And so it's
Mm.
kind of a balancing act,
Mm.
and I haven't always known how to balance that very well. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, I do think that, we can learn some things from ancient literature, even when the author isn't known. But if we do know who the author is, I think that can really add to it if it's a credible author. Um, if it's a pseudonymous writing, so let's say, many scholars don't think Second Peter was written by Peter
Hmm.
or an amanuensis, or they don't think a secretary of his wrote it either. Now, I've not really studied the matter, so I can't really comment on it. But let's just say, for the sake of argument or our discussion, what we're having right now, if Peter was not at all involved in the writing of Second Peter, you know, how do we know that what is being reported is true? Or some might say that the pastoral letters of First, Second Timothy, and Titus, they don't. If they don't think they were written by Paul, some would say that maybe they were written by one of Paul's disciples to address some situations that existed at the time, and this guy is writing to say, well, this is what Paul would have said to that. Well, if it was one of Paul's disciples, yeah, then, that could be pretty interesting. It could be kind of reliable in terms of basically or essentially reflecting what Paul would have thought if this guy had traveled with Paul and knew Paul well. But if it's a pseudonymous letter, like um, Third Corinthians, that is considered pseudonymous. We don't believe that Paul wrote that. How reliable is it? Can we trust it? Now, the Gospels could not be said to be pseudonymous because um, most believe that the autographs, the originals of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, did not contain the author's name. Now, some would say, like Martin Hengel, a great New Testament scholar, argued that they did. I don't agree with him on that. I'll go with the majority. And the reason being is because, and I don't really hear this by others, but as I studied Plutarch and look at other ancient biographies, hardly any of them contain the author's name in the title or the proem. So of the nearly 100 or approximately 90 biographies that were written about someone, and they were written within 150 years on each side of Jesus. So we're talking about a total of a 300-year period. There's only one biography that contains the author's name, and it's not in the title, it's in the proem, and it's Lucian of Samosata's Passing of Peregrinus, where he's writing to his patron, and he's telling, he mentions his own name, Lucian, in writing that. But other than that, no one else in those biographies are mentioning their name in that biography. In fact, Plutarch is considered to be the greatest ancient biographer, and his name doesn't appear anywhere, not in the
Right.
title, not in the proem, not anywhere throughout any of the 48 lives that he wrote that have survived. Um, so, if that was the standard practice of ancient biography, not to have the author's name in the title, it shouldn't surprise us that the gospel authors' names aren't in the title. But no one questions whether Suetonius wrote the lives of the Caesars, or
Right.
that Plutarch wrote Plutarch's lives, or that Sallust wrote those three histories, or that Tacitus wrote the Annals. Tacitus does, in a sense, identify himself in the Annals. He doesn't mention his name, but he does mention his father-in-law. So if unless no one but Tacitus is known to be a historian who wrote about this other guy who would have been his father-in-law. Like Tacitus didn't have another brother who was known to be a historian. So Tacitus would have been the likely author there, but still, they're anonymous. People knew who wrote these, though. We don't know how they knew it, but they knew it, and it was attributed to them at a very early date. And the same thing, we have that with the Gospels. Yeah, they're formally anonymous, but at a very early date, we have people naming who the authors were.
Yeah, and not only
Yeah,
that, but we don't have a lot of competing traditions. We don't have people
yeah.
saying, "No, Matthew was written by so and so." So in the absence of competing traditions and the presence of a robust tradition that is in favor of that author, you pretty much don't really have a problem anymore, as far as I'm concerned. Now, I might be overreaching, I might be overstepping the case, but uh, I think that's kind of a pretty solid case, especially when you realize that the risk of being wrong about that is actually fairly low, because of the fact that the historical record really kind of speaks for itself, and the authorship is can kind of be considered secondary, in my opinion,
Hmm.
especially if there isn't any competing tradition. But
Yeah.
we have a question here. What exactly do you
There
mean
only
by the
is a
author?
competing tradition once, and that's in the fourth century. There's a writer that says earlier there were some people who attributed the Gospel of John to Cerinthus. So that's the only exception of which I'm aware uh, against Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's it. And it's fourth century, talking about an
Right.
earlier tradition.
Yeah, it's very late. Yeah. Well, so the question, what exactly do you mean by the authorship problem? And maybe I didn't articulate that very well. As far as I'm concerned, the authorship problem is simply that the Gospels are pseudonymous, and so therefore,
Anonymous, not pseudonymous.
well, they're not. I'm sorry, anonymous. That's right. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
The
That's why
Gospel
you're the
of
scholar and
Peter,
I'm
Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Thomas,
yeah.
Gospel of Philip, those are pseudonymous.
Those are right, right. Yep. Thank you. That's why you're the scholar and I'm the
No, it's
amateur
easy
here.
to get them confused.
So I hope that answers the question. And it's I don't again I don't necessarily think it's a problem, but I think it's a problem for some people who consider the lack of an authorship or the lack of a signature
Mm.
to be significant, and that it's going to detract from the historicity of the account. And I don't think it does. But for people who do think it does and who are uncomfortable with that problem, I think we can give them a robust answer. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, I think the problem can be largely solved. So,
I think the evidence for the traditional authorship of the Gospels is quite good, actually. I was really surprised. Now, I've supervised master's theses for two students, one who did it on Mark, one who did it on Luke Acts, and they surveyed 200 critical scholars writing in English since 1965 to see where English commentators and scholars are on this. And the majority who comment on it do embrace the traditional authorship of Mark and Luke. Um, I have a friend who did his master's thesis on the same thing at the Gospel of John, but at a different place, not at Houston Christian University, where I teach. And he found that even though the majority of critical scholars today don't think that John, the son of Zebedee, wrote the Gospel of John, um, they do think that John's gospel is largely based on the eyewitness testimony of one of his disciples, and that's pretty significant. Um, so, yeah, in answer to the question, the reason it's important, and I'm sorry I didn't answer this more directly before about the problem. Um, if the Gospels are not written by the traditional authors, then we wonder, well, who are they written by? Of course, um, and are they credible? And but if they are written by the traditional authors, that brings us really close to the eyewitnesses, right? Because Mark was Peter's translator and wrote down what he remembered Peter said. Luke was a traveling companion of Paul and knew some of the other, so he getting his information from Paul, some of the other eyewitnesses, and those who knew the eyewitnesses. Of course, he's using Mark as well. Matthew would have been an eyewitness, so if he's behind that gospel in some sense, you got eyewitness testimony there, right? So, and John would have been one of the 12 disciples and one of Jesus' three closest disciples. So these are, I mean, we are really close to Jesus, and these would be four independent accounts. And even though Matthew and Luke are most likely using Mark, largely they are supplementing it, and they do contribute their own Matthew eyewitness testimony and Luke from what he had heard from eyewitnesses. So, yeah, that's pretty good stuff. So, if they're not
right.
written by the traditional authors, yeah, the evidence that we have then for the life of Jesus is not quite as strong, but you still have multiple independent sources in a number of instances, and they're still quite early, and probably still rooted in some sense in eyewitness testimony.
Right. And just the nature of the witness itself gives us evidence that we're what you're actually reading is eyewitness testimony. It has that eyewitness smell to it. So, that's
It
a
does, when like in Mark's gospel, Peter's personality pops more than any other disciple involved.
right.
He's ambitious. He flies off the cuff quickly. He's emotional. He's committed. He is right there. He wants to die with Jesus, and then the
It's
next moment
impulsive.
he's denying him, and he's grief stricken and wept.
Yeah.
When you have that, that looks like, that is coming from an eyewitness, from Peter and one who knew him. And the Papias, our earliest source, who's writing in the early second century, who says he got his information from associates of the apostles and did so while at least two of them were still alive and active in their ministry. Um, he informs us that Mark was Peter's translator and that Mark wrote down what he remembered Peter saying. So that's pretty cool stuff. I mean, but the fact that Peter is so prominent in that way in terms of his personality, and then you look and when Jesus is mentioned to be with his disciples and he names, and those disciples are named, there are 21 occurrences of that in the Gospel of Mark. And in 19 of them, Peter's name appears. And in nearly half of those, he's the only disciple in view.
Right.
The only other disciple to get a solo appearance with Jesus in Mark is John, and he gets only one. So that looks like, um, Peter's voice behind Mark's pen.
Yeah. Well, I have a question here. I put it up there for a second, but I didn't want to detract from what you were saying. We have same questioner researching this for the book of Hebrews. There's a relatively strong case for Priscilla being the author. I'm fine with this, but how should I go about thinking with which authorship is reliable?
Hebrews, it's really difficult. I mean, there are so many. I've not heard of Priscilla before. I've heard of Luke. I've heard of Lazarus. I've heard of Apollos. My former Greek professor, he thought that Apollo, he did his doctoral dissertation on that text in Hebrews where it talks about those who were once enlightened and fallen away. He was F. F. Bruce's final doctoral student. He believes that Apollos is probably the best candidate for it. I've also heard Barnabas. We really just don't know. So I think we just agree with Origen in the early third century, where it says, "Who wrote Hebrews? Only God knows." But sometimes we
Right.
don't. It's like in Genesis, we say, you say the Pentateuch was written by Moses, right? But yet in Exodus, not Genesis, but Exodus, you have the death of Moses. And what happened? Well, certainly Moses didn't write that. Who did? Well, we don't know. We don't know the authorship of many of the Psalms. So David did not write all of the Psalms. We don't know the authorship of some of them. So it doesn't mean they're not divinely inspired or shouldn't be
Right.
in the canon.
Well, the an epistle and a book like Exodus, part of the Pentateuch, that's a little bit of a different question than a book that is giving us historical records. So the authorship problem may not be as important for something like epistles or something like Hebrews or other epistles as it is for some of the gospels. Would you agree with that?
I think so. I think so. I mean, well, let's take, for example, First Clement. Um, I'd say a lot of scholars think that that was written by Clement of Rome. That's the traditional author of that, or Polycarp's letter to the church in Philippi. I don't think there's much question about whether Polycarp wrote that. Polycarp is an associate of the Apostle John. He's known to be a disciple of the Apostle John. So, I mean, we look at that; those are still very important letters. We learn through them. It informs us about early Christianity. It informs us what the church was thinking at that point and some of their practices. Um, so with Hebrews, that's written even earlier. I mean, I don't know when it was written. Could have been written in the 70s, but some, I think, plausibly date it to the 60s and before, because at some point in it talks about the temple sacrifices going on and it mentions them in the present tense. Well,
Right.
after the year 70, that wasn't happening anymore.
Yeah.
So
Right.
Hebrews may have been written prior to 70. So it doesn't name who the author is. So it's not pseudonymous, it's anonymous. So
Right.
it still tells us um, about at least what many in the early church or some in the early church were believing at that point.
Right. Yeah, and I'll never make the pseudonymous anonymous mistake again, I promise. But but I think that the argument about the present tense treatment of the temple in Hebrews is a little bit stronger than most people realize, and the reason I say that is because if when the temple was destroyed in AD 70, that was a big deal for
Mhm.
Second Temple Judaism. I mean, that was an enormous, just far-reaching event in its impact. And so it's just to me, and this is my opinion, so I'm not gonna be dogmatic about it, but to me, I can't I can't conceive of the author of Hebrews not mentioning the fact that the temple was destroyed in his epistle. I really can't. I just cannot give any credence to that idea, because if it was such a big deal, surely the writer of Hebrews would have mentioned it, because the writer of Hebrews is constantly discussing the themes about the temple and about
Mhm.
sacrifices and those kinds of
Mhm.
things. So for him to not mention it, if it would actually been destroyed, or for him to not know about it, to me, I don't even think that's plausible at all. So
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. The temple isn't the destruction of the temple isn't mentioned in John's gospel, and most believe that John's gospel is written, 20 or more years, 20 to 25 years after the temple was destroyed. But um, it's not they're not talking about the same kind of things like the author of Hebrews is. It's not as important in the context of John's gospel as it is in Hebrews.
right. Well, I want to kind of touch on three things, and one of them is something that you alluded to already, and that is this idea of parody. Because the way that I've approached it is I've named the problem selective skepticism,
Hmm.
where the New Testament is is given a certain standard for historicity, and that same standard is not applied to the rest of ancient history. And so that's basically, I think, what you're talking about there as far as parody is concerned.
Yes.
But but I like the idea of the skepticism that's creeping in there, because there's the New Testament is always treated with a higher standard than the rest of ancient history, at least in terms of the skeptical scholars that are trying to assess whether or not it's historically reliable and so on. And so I have made a lot of hay about this selective skepticism problem or issue, and I kind of come down pretty hard on the skeptics, because the, sometimes their standards, even in my opinion, wipe out all of ancient history. I mean, they
Mhm.
they they almost destroy whether or not we can even know anything about ancient history at all if they were to apply the same standards evenly. So, uh, and I've written about this, and I have these discussions from time to time. But there's another issue, and this is the second issue that I wanted to talk about, that kind of dovetails into the first issue, and that is that, well, Phil, the Gospels contain accounts of supernatural events, and so that's why we don't hold them to the same standard. Because if you have a historical account that has a supernatural event in it, that automatically disqualifies it from being historically reliable. And the way that I've pushed back on this, and my logic professor at the University of Colorado brought this up actually during class one time. He said one of the basic fundamental principles of historiography is that if a historical account contains a supernatural event, then you can automatically dismiss it as historically unreliable. And I raised my hand, and he didn't like it when I raised my hand, because I always ask difficult questions. But I raised my hand and I said, "Well, is that a historical investigative issue or principle, or is that a philosophical bias that you're applying to the account? And I would argue that is not a valid principle in historical investigation. What that is that's superimposing a philosophical bias onto a historical account and assuming, based on your personal philosophical commitments, that this can't be reliable history.
Hmm.
And so sometimes Christians struggle with this, and so it's worth us having that conversation, because I want to encourage Christians and help them understand that this is a prejudice. It's not a historical principle.
That's right. I agree with you wholeheartedly. He was weighing in with his worldview, not as a historian. And the
Right.
danger of that is evident. Bad philosophy corrupts good history. So the illustration I'd like to give is that, let's say astronomers have discovered a comet that is looks like they know from its trajectory that it's going to crash into the moon on a certain day and time. And when that day arrives, you've got space telescopes that are zoomed in on the lunar surface, and at the appointed time, it's bam, it slams into the moon. And as the lunar dust settles, there is a message written on the moon's surface, and it says, Jesus is Lord. And it's written in Hebrew and in Greek. Now, a good, responsible astronomer, a scientist, would say, that's an extraordinary event. I have no plausible natural explanations for it. It would seem to require God, but as a scientist, I don't have the tools to be able to identify God as the cause. So I'm just going to have to settle for acknowledging the occurrence of the event and leaving the cause of the event undetermined. Now, here's what a poor, naive scientist how they would respond. Wow, that's an extraordinary event, and I have no plausible explanations, natural explanations of how that would occur. It would seem to require God, but as a scientist, I possess no tools for identifying the God as the cause for something. So I can't even acknowledge that the event occurred. Now, we would say
Didn't
that's
happen.
lunacy,
Didn't
um,
happen.
but that's exactly what the skeptical historians and philosophers and scholars, that's exactly the approach that they want to take, this
Right.
lunacy of an approach. No, if the evidence for the event itself is sufficient, you can acknowledge the occurrence of the event, but leave the cause of the event undetermined. So I'd be perfectly fine as a historian to conclude Jesus came back to life. I wouldn't say resurrection because that's putting on a theological interpretation in it, and that's hard to do as a historian. Um, so you could say Jesus returned from the dead, he rose from the dead. I'm just going to have to leave the cause of the event undetermined because I don't have the tools. It would seem to suggest God did it, but I can't confirm that. And I could be satisfied with that. And you could practice history of that as a historian.
Right. And so I listened to a debate between Bart Ehrman and I think a Christian apologist, but I don't remember who the person he was debating was. But the whole case that Bart Ehrman made in this debate was people just don't rise from the dead. So case closed. And so at least during that debate, maybe I'm not necessarily saying that outside the debate, but at least within the scope of that debate, Bart was not even willing to consider any evidence because his philosophical bias had already ruled out the conclusion. And I
Yeah.
thought, I was disappointed because I consider Bart a disciplined scholar, and I have a lot of respect for him. I had a conversation with him a couple of years ago about why he decided to become an unbeliever, and and so and his answer, by the way, was not scholarly. It was an emotional answer,
Hmm.
and that kind of took me by surprise. Well, in one way it did, but in another way it doesn't take me by surprise, because I think most of the time whenever people leave the faith, they leave it for emotional reasons and on the basis of logical fallacies. But uh, I wish that I could have a conversation with him again and try to bring up this issue that that it's not a very credible approach to say I'm going to rule this out because of my worldview, and I'm not even going to look at the evidence anymore. And again, outside of the scope of that debate, I'm not sure he has treated or examined the evidence for the resurrection on its own terms. Maybe he has, maybe he hasn't, but that debate was very recent.
Hmm.
So, you know, and that is, he's a trendsetter for a lot of people, especially for skeptics now,
Yeah.
because the skeptics they love looking at Bart and saying, yeah, Bart used to be a believer, but he's not anymore, and look at his academic credentials. So what are you going to do with that? And a lot of people are heavily influenced by that, uh, and especially when the problem of evil can drive people away from their discipleship, in Christ. So that's important. But the other thing that I wanted to talk about is that it's always a little bit problematic and awkward to look at a popular level TV presentation of the gospel and of the life of Jesus and trying to draw any conclusions from it.
Yeah.
But I've watched this show called The Chosen, and it is wildly popular, and I have lots of Christian friends who just love that show. And I saw something in that show in one of the episodes that that really that really started me thinking, not because I think that there's any reliable, there's any reliable ideology from the show, because it's a popular TV show, and we don't get our theology and our ideology from TV, but during most of these episodes, we have the person who is playing Matthew constantly sitting down by a tree, writing down everything that Jesus said, and writing down the things that the disciples said, and writing down the things that he saw, all of the events that he saw. And he's keeping copious notes of everything that he's witnessing during the ministry of Jesus. And I thought, well, I've never heard a lot of scholars who actually believe that it happened that way. But to me, if Matthew was a tax collector, then that means he was literate, and that he knew how to keep notes and knew how to keep records, because that was his whole vocation in life. And so it doesn't seem implausible to me that he would be writing things down. Why wouldn't he, if he's literate and if he knows how to keep good records and so on? And so the question that I would put to you is, do you think that's plausible? And and are there arguments against that kind of a narrative?
So yeah, I look, I love The Chosen. I don't know what you think about it. I love it. Um, especially, every season seems to get better. And I just feel like after every episode, I just want to get alone with God for 5 to 10 minutes and pray. I mean, it just inspires me.
Right.
The author does take, or Dallas Jenkins and the writers do take, artistic liberty, artistic license. And
Sure.
that's okay. Mel Gibson did it in his movie, The Passion of the Christ. You have Jesus stomping on the head of the snake in the garden in Gethsemane. I have no problem with that.
Right.
You've got that really touching scene when Jesus is carrying the cross and he stumbles and falls, and his mother runs up to him, and it says to his mother, "Behold, I am making all things new." And he picks up the cross, looks forward with determination, and starts moving ahead. And it's like, wow, that's inspiring. It's like what Hebrews, I think it's 12:2 says, for the joy set before him, the joy set before him, Jesus endured the cross, despising its shame. It's like, well, that's kind of, even though, as far as we know, that scene never occurred, um, it communicates a biblical truth
Right.
about Jesus, and it's just inspiring and touching. So I don't mind the artistic license to an extent. Um, did Matthew do that? I have my doubts. Did he take some notes of Jesus' teaching along the way? I would have no problem with that at all. In fact, I would guess one of the disciples probably did that. Why not Matthew? He would have been literate. I don't know how literate. You don't have to be real literate to be a tax collector. You just have to be able to do some math and some things. But um, certainly not the degree of literacy that we find in Matthew's gospel, which has some really cool artistic elements in it. Um,
Right.
but maybe the hypothetical Q source was something that Matthew wrote. He took notes of Jesus' teaching. I mean, that hypothetical source is just almost exclusively teachings of Jesus outside of any narrative. And it would make sense, maybe he just wrote down some of these teachings of Jesus as they go along. Remember, Jesus sends them out in twos to go teach. Maybe he takes those to kind of keep track and be able to look at his notes to refresh about some of these teachings. Um, Even James D.G. Dunn, who was a moderate to conservative New Testament scholar, he's open to the idea that that's what Q was, that one of the disciples took notes. Um, I don't, I tend not to think that Matthew was the one that um, I think he probably had an editor that helped him with this. And it's a very involved, I think the authorship of Matthew is probably the toughest of them all. Um,
Right.
and what makes it tough, Phil, for me, is you have Papias in the early second century, the same guy who talks about Mark's gospel, that Mark wrote down what he remembered Peter said, and he was Peter's translator. He says Matthew wrote the talagia, the oracles, in the Hebrew dialect, which could mean Aramaic, it could mean Hebrew, it could mean Aramaic. But it's hard to think of the talagia, oracles, as referring to an entire gospel or biography. We don't find that elsewhere. And our Gospel of Matthew, even according to evangelical New Testament scholars who really know their Greek, they I mean really know it better than most, better than me, better than most. I'm talking about people like D.A. Carson or Dan Wallace, people like that. They
Right.
say that um, Matthew is not translation Greek. So, and I've seen the arguments to say it's not translation Greek, and they're pretty compelling, at least in my view. So it's not that there was an original Gospel of Matthew written in Aramaic or Hebrew, and then that was in turn translated into Greek Matthew that we have. Now, there are, I believe it's 5 or 7 early church fathers who talk about a Hebrew Gospel of Matthew, that Matthew did write a gospel originally in Hebrew. Um, I tend to think that that's correct, but I don't think that that's what we have. I don't know what Papias is referring to. I don't think it's Q, because Q seems like the Q material seems like it was originally written in Greek as well. So I don't know what Matthew's referring to. Whatever it was, I think that it has been lost. So if I had to guess, and this is just speculation, but my speculation, you have Josephus, he writes his account of the Jewish war in Aramaic, his native tongue. He said that's what he did. And then later on, he had help with slaves, educated slaves, who helped him translate it into Greek. And he could speak, he could write in Greek, but it wasn't polished, so he had others help him with it. Well, what's interesting is the Aramaic version of the Jewish war has been lost. The Greek version has survived because Greek reached a whole larger audience, readership. So I think
Right.
what may have happened, if I had to speculate, which, oh, that's what I'm doing, my best guess at the moment is Matthew originally wrote a gospel in Hebrew, and he sent it to the Jews in Judea. Um, but he wanted to get a much larger readership. So he wanted to do a Greek version. But he recognized that his Greek wasn't the best. And so he got a secretary, an amanuensis, and said, help me with this. And the secretary took Mark's gospel because Mark had already translated much of Jesus' teachings into Greek. And so rather than providing a fresh translation, he used uh, 90% of Mark in there, and then he supplemented it with other Matthew lightly edited Mark, and then Matthew provided additional, gave his secretary additional information that Matthew knew. And 44% of Matthew's gospel, because it's a longer gospel than Mark, 44% of it is material that's not in Mark. So, and then I think the secretary just added some artistic uh, flares to it, and that's the gospel we have. And because it was written in Greek, that's the gospel that survived, and the Hebrew gospel was eventually lost.
So I can just hear the skeptics saying, "Well, this is really complicated and this very convoluted. Isn't the history going to be lost in all this on all these complications?" And by the way, I wanted to Dale says hi to Phil and Mike here real quick. So wanted to
Hi,
say hi,
Dale.
hi Dale. Yeah. So what do you say to people who will say, "I can't believe how complicated and how convoluted this is, and I can't believe that the actual historical facts are going to actually survive this kind of soup, that we're trying to navigate."
Well, we're really only talking about Matthew there. That gets kind of convoluted. But see, it's a puzzle. And, you got Papias, what he reports. You have early church fathers and what they report. And we're trying to fit this together and see what is actually going on here. Now, if you just want to be an inveterate skeptic, you just blow the whole thing off and said, they're all wrong. But I'm trying to approach this in a logical and an authentic, honest way and try to make sense of these reports and what's going on. I mean, that is a speculative thing that's going on. I do think it makes sense of the reports. Scholars tried to figure out it's called the synoptic problem. Which gospel was written first? Overwhelming majority say Mark, but then it gets more complicated from there. You've got over 200 verses that appear in Matthew and Luke that are absent from Mark. Where do they come from? And you got verses that are common to Matthew and Luke. In other words, same tradition. Like, for example, ask and it will be given, seek and you will find, knock and the door will be open. For everyone who asks receives, the one who seeks finds, to the one who knocks the door will be open to them. That's over 30 words in Greek, and it's verbatim in Matthew and in Luke. So where does that come from? Well, either Matthew is using Luke, or Luke is using Matthew, or they're both using a source we no longer have. That could be oral tradition, it could be written tradition. Most scholars today think it's a written tradition and they call it Q. Why? Because the German word for source is Quella, so they just abbreviated Q. That's all Q is. So it's nothing to be threatened by. It could, you could have some notes written by Matthew or some other disciple that took them during Jesus's ministry. That could be what it is, which would mean this Q source would go all the way back to the time of Jesus's ministry when it was composed. So that's pretty cool stuff. So does it get kind of convoluted? I guess you could say yes, but I mean, you got this kind of stuff in antiquity with other things, with other non-Christian literature, some of it. So what do you do with that? We try to figure out, hey, look, when it comes to science, trying to figure out you know, is light wave or is it particle? Maybe that's been resolved by now. I don't know. But, they try to figure out things. Theoretical entities come up. They posit theoretical entities. You could say, well, that's ad hoc. That's highly speculative. What do we do with that? Well, you come up with these theories that try to account for the known phenomena. And that's exactly what we're doing with this stuff. It doesn't mean that history would be lost. If anything, it just might mean we don't know the answers to these things, but it doesn't mean that history would be lost. Either way you look at it, I think that Matthew's gospel, we have good reason to think, even if what I've just proposed is wrong, we still have good reason to think that Matthew was involved in some sense in the composition of that gospel. And so it would be rooted in eyewitness testimony.
Yeah. Okay, well, we need to say so long to Algorithm 777. He says, got to go, but thanks for the discussion, Phil and Mike. And but thank you also for your questions. I appreciate it. So yeah, history is messy. History is messy business, and science is messy business. All of these intellectual pursuits are going to be complicated. And if everything was just clean and cut and dried, and that there were no ambiguities, there were no problems that we're trying to solve, then that would actually diminish the reliability of this. That would point to, yeah, this really isn't history because it's too easy. And so I've always considered all of these issues and all of these problems and possibly even confusions to actually strengthen the case and not to weaken it. So, I think that's a good point. Dale says, what does Mike make of the atheist scholar James Crossley arguing Mark's gospel dates to 40 AD?
Yeah, that's pretty good. Now, I think Crossley is an agnostic. Maybe he's changed, but last I heard he was an agnostic. His mentor, Morris Casey, was an agnostic bordering on atheism, but an agnostic nevertheless. Yeah, Crossley and Casey both believe that the Gospel of Mark was probably composed in the year 40. Now, they didn't believe a lot of the stuff in it, of course, as agnostics, but they believe that's when it was composed. I haven't really read their arguments for that. There are some others who would place it in the 40s and 50s. I was surprised at the number of scholars who put it in the 50s that early. In fact, only about 10% of those who are willing to give it a date, of those approximately 200 scholars who write in English from 1965 to about 2019, only about 10% of them place Mark after the year 70. That's pretty interesting. So what do I think of it? I think it's possible. We really just don't know when these gospels were written. We can make arguments for it. You have Eusebius talks about when John's gospel was written, would have been in the 90s. But Dan Wallace has made a decent argument putting it in the 60s, just prior to the temple's destruction in 70. But really, we just don't know. The gospel authors do not tell us when they're writing. So we can make educated guesses, but we really don't know. Now, Clement of Alexandria informs us that Mark and John were written during the lifetimes of Mark and John. So that would still allow into the 90s with John. We don't know when Mark died. But it would be while Peter was still alive, and church tradition puts Peter's crucifixion, I think 64 or 65 AD. So that would have meant that Mark would have been written probably by 65, no later than 65 AD. So I don't know Crossley's arguments for placing Mark so early, but I would guess, I mean, I'd be open to it. That'd be pretty cool if it was that early.
Well, yeah, no kidding. I mean, and it's interesting that we have an atheist or an agnostic, whatever he calls himself, who's interested in these issues and is trying to come up with an early date for Mark, and thinking that there's good reason for it. And
Hmm.
sometimes I think, well, if you're not a believer, why do you care? And do you realize that this actually may strengthen the case for the Christian faith and for the historicity of the Gospels and Christ and so on. So I think that is interesting. Recently, I had a conversation with somebody who calls herself Godless Granny, and
Hmm.
she wanted to talk about a book that I published earlier this year called "Deconstructing Junk Theology," and I thought, why you're an atheist? Why are you interested in these theological issues? And I talked to Bill Cluck about that, who is James Walker's partner in crime over at the Atheist and Christian Book Club. And I think you've been a guest on that book club, if I'm not mistaken. And
Maybe I don't remember. I like James Walker. I'm not familiar with the other name you mentioned. I know James. It's been a while since we talked, but I know he's
well,
got
Bill
an
Cluck,
effective ministry.
that was Bill Cluck was his partner, his founding partner for the
Oh,
Atheist and
nice.
Christian Book Club. And and
So the
Bill
Atheist
Cluck,
and Christian Book Club is his former partner. Was he a Christian or atheist?
yeah, well, Bill used to be a Christian, and then he deconverted
Okay.
and became an atheist. And so he was an atheist for many years, and he was
Hmm.
an atheist when they founded the book club. And
Okay.
so what they do is they trade off every month, and they uh, they discuss a book from the Christian perspective, and then they discuss one from the atheist perspective the next
Nice.
month.
Sounds
So
like fun.
they've had they've had Bart Ehrman and Lawrence Krauss. That was when I had the conversation with Bart Ehrman, was during the book club session. And but just in the last year, Bill has actually renounced his atheism, and because he had a crisis of faith in atheism, and so he
Mm.
has now become a theist.
Okay.
And
That's a
so he's
step in the
trying.
right direction.
It is. And I told him, we're all praying that you're going to go all the way here. And but he's kind of following in Anthony Fleur's footsteps, because Anthony Fleur went from atheism to theism, but he became a deist. So he stopped at deism and didn't go all the way to Christianity, as far as we know.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I
His
told Bill,
stumbling block was hell.
yeah, well, exactly. And I asked Bill. I said, Bill, why are all these atheists so interested in theology? Why do they want to talk theology with me? And he
What
said,
do you
Phil,
say?
you would. He said you'd be surprised how many atheists want to talk theology. And so that was kind of an eye opener for me. And I kind of think of the same thing with Crossley. So uh, maybe some gears are turning, and maybe this will lead to something. I don't know. We can
Mm.
always hope. We can always pray for that. So. But thanks for that question, Dale. I appreciate you being here. And But I also wanted to bring up something else. I wanted to share real quickly, if you don't mind. My understanding is that you're kind of moving from being focused primarily on the resurrection to being focused primarily on the Gospels. Is that a good
That's correct.
kind of a good description of your
Hmm.
direction?
I still do some
So
stuff on the resurrection. In fact, I have one more book I want to write on the resurrection, a more popular version. But yeah, my focus now is on the Gospels.
okay. Um, yeah, and real quickly, Dale says, "Wow, I was a general atheist for 8 years when Gary and Mike helped me out during my research, and now I'm a Christian." So it can
Awesome.
and does happen. Yeah. So
Wonderful.
yeah,
Glad to hear that,
Dale
Dale.
Dale is by the way, Dale is kind of my unofficial uh co-host,
Oh,
because
okay.
I've put out a couple hundred podcast episodes, and he's probably with me on maybe half of them, maybe more. So I don't know. But Dale keeps me honest because he doesn't always agree with everything I say, and so it's good for me to have Dale on because that way I'm humbled and challenged, and sometimes I open my podcast with "I'm Phil Bear and I'm not infallible." I'm Phil Bear and I could be wrong.
What's Dale's last name?
Glover.
Oh, I know Dale.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, he's a good
Yep.
guy.
Yep. Yeah. He's a great guy.
Yeah, Mr. Shroud.
Uh huh. Exactly. Yeah. So what I want to do is real quickly. I want to share the fact that I've just published a new book on the resurrection called the Knowable Resurrection, and and there's still a lot of overlap with between you and me because I don't necessarily. I mean, I'm focused generally on the resurrection, but a whole lot of my case for the resurrection has to do with the historical reliability of the Gospels themselves. And so what I've done, and you can tell me if I'm crazy or if I'm misguided here, but what I've done is I've tried to come up with some historical data that we can reason from, and and that data that we reason from is not historical in nature. It's just simply I'm sorry, not historical. Not supernatural in nature. Sorry about that. I probably sounded kind of incoherent. Um, so what I'm doing is I'm trying to reason from non-supernatural historical facts, and then move from using the non-supernatural historical facts to the historical fact of the resurrection. And so I think that we can reason from the historicity of the Gospels and the book of Acts, but we don't reason from the supernatural claims. We
Mhm.
reason from the non-supernatural claims to the supernatural claim. And so I have had a great deal of assistance over the course of my lifetime from Dr. Craig Blomberg, who wrote the foreword to this book. And I have we have had hours and hours and hours of discussions about these issues. And I think that the reliability of the Gospels is stronger than most people realize, or stronger than most people actually sometimes will care to admit. Uh, but when we're reasoning to the resurrection, a lot of those cases for the resurrection rely on the claims of the supernatural, but a lot of them don't necessarily rely on the claims of the supernatural. So we don't assume that the reports of the apostles having experiences with Jesus after the resurrection, experiences of him being alive, we don't rely on those necessarily. But what I rely on is the fact that they were absolutely convinced that Jesus had risen from the dead. And that carries a lot of weight because that is not a supernatural claim.
Right. Right. And
And
it's
not,
one that virtually everyone agrees, no matter how
right,
skeptical.
right, yeah. And so what I'm doing is I'm simply arguing, and I think that's what the minimal facts argument is all about as well,
Hmm.
because it's all these minimal facts are facts that, I mean, Gary Habermas has said that the majority of scholars now actually agree that these really are factual. And but I'm taking it from an epistemic standpoint, but the reliability of the text is still important in both of those scenarios. And so that's why what I want to do is I would like to be able to network with people in order to strengthen that case for the historical reliability. And in my book, I rely on Blomberg heavily, and
He's a good
I
guy.
have,
He's written the best book on the topic so far.
yeah. Well, and that was kind of the book that I've worn out the pages on, the historical
Mm.
reliability of the Gospels. So,
It's an
but
amazing book.
but Craig and I, in the 90s, Craig and I used to meet for lunch once a month. And
Mm,
we had all these discussions about theology and biblical studies and history and the reliability of the Gospels and apologetics and those kinds of things. I could never, ever even begin to describe how much I have learned
mm,
from Dr. Blomberg. But there are times when I found myself disagreeing with him on certain issues, and he can absorb that as well. You know, he's
yeah.
such a humble guy, and that's one reason why our friendship has been so fruitful is because he's so approachable, and and I want to try to emulate that kind of humility myself, and that's why I try to mention at least once in all my podcast episodes that I'm Phil Bear and I could be wrong. you know
You know, what I love about Craig is, not only is he a great New Testament scholar, but he walks the walk. He's a godly man. I'll tell you a
Right.
story. You probably wouldn't want me to tell you this, but or to make this public. But years ago, my wife Debbie, she has her family is out in Nebraska, and there were some people related to one of her relatives. I forgot what the relation was, but they were involved in a very, very serious car accident. And I think one lost their legs. And I mean, it was bad. And they were both in the hospital, or one was in the hospital, or something. I forgot what it was. Um, but they needed a car. They didn't have a car now. And they were in a really, really bad situation. And so Debbie put out the word to some people on it, on Facebook, I think it was. These people in Nebraska need some help. This is before, I think this is before, what do you call it? Where you raise funds, GoFundMe.
Yep.
Um, but they want to see, is there anyone that can help them? Maybe bring some food or things like this. Nobody out there in the Midwest volunteered, and then Craig Blomberg did. And he went to see them in the hospital, and he said, "I've got a car you can use. What do you need?" I mean, that's Christianity in action. That's
Right.
godliness there. And so, yeah, he's a tremendous brother, a brilliant scholar, and just an amazing guy. I have
Yeah.
so much admiration for Craig Blomberg. He and I don't agree on everything either, but it's like you said, it's not a big deal. You know, we can disagree, and that's okay.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
But when I disagree with him, I do it very, very carefully because he knows more about the Gospels than I ever will.
Well, whenever I disagree with Craig, I always make fun of him and I always say, well, we disagree with that, but it's okay for you to be wrong, so
Yeah.
and he always chuckles and so he has the same kind of attitude. So well, tell you what, if you have anything to share, I'd love to hear a little bit more about the direction you're going and what you're doing, and if there's something that's coming up, I'd love to hear about that, and then if we can kind of wrap up after that. But I want to know where we can go to follow your work. Is there a website? Is there a YouTube channel? How can we follow along with the exciting work that you're doing? And what have you got coming up that we can watch out for?
Well, follow me. My website is risenjesus.com. I'm on Facebook, I'm on X, I'm on Instagram and TikTok. But very honestly, we have social media contractors. They handle all of that. Um, I don't really accept friend requests on my personal Facebook page, but people can follow what I'm doing on my public figure page. Um, my my website, I don't know if I meant risenjesus.com, have a YouTube channel. We have over 1,000 videos, or up to almost about 1,000 videos. Get about 1 million views a year. So we're not one of the biggest channels, but so you type in my name. I think it's just Dr. Mike Licona, or maybe it's Mike Licona official. I forgot which one. That'll take you to our YouTube channel, or just put my name in, you'll see the channel up. I still teach at Houston Christian University. So we offer master's degree in Christian apologetics. We have certificate programs as well. And you can find out more about that at hc.edu/defend. And we are much better than Biola or Liberty or any of these other schools.
Oh, of course. Of course.
Much better than Sean McDowell, and where he teaches at Biola. You can tell him I said that.
Yep. All right. Well, that's great, Mike. I tell you what, I appreciate you coming on so much, and this has been a treat for me. I've always enjoyed your contribution to the scholarship, and so this has been a wonderful honor for me, and it's a treat. And so maybe we can have some more conversations in the future, and
Sure.
if you'd like, we can actually make that happen. I'm going to move into more of a recording mode for the podcast, and I'm probably going to move away from the live mode a little bit, uh, because there's a great deal of expense involved, and I'm trying to get by on a shoestring with my ministry here.
Mm.
But the other question I have is, how can people support your ministry as well? Are there places on
Well,
risenjesus.com where we
yeah, you go to
can?
risenjesus.com. There's a donate page there.
Okay.
And they can do that. They can do it through, there's an address that they could send a check to, or they can just do it through credit card. Some of our donors set it up where they have their bank just send a monthly thing. But yeah, that's how they can support, and we would appreciate that too. We really would. Um, Most of our funds that come in are from donors, so thank you. Anyone who wants to give, yeah, we appreciate anything. And it's very kind of you to even say that. But yeah, whether you give or not, please just check out our resources. We've got a lot of videos that could, for educational purposes, that can help you, encourage you. We've got a whole playlist on doubt. We have another playlist that has all my debates on there. We have another playlist that has critical issues in New Testament studies and things like that. So, how was the canon formed? People I interviewed on that, like Lee Martin McDonald, the foremost authority in the world on the topic. We talked about formation of the Old Testament canon, the New Testament canon. What do we do with the Apocrypha, or the deuterocanonical literature? I've had Dan Wallace on to talk about English translations and manuscripts and all this stuff. We've, Dale Allison and people like that. So yeah, and we also have a thing called Fly on the Wall. These are like half-hour videos. Uh, I've had so many people say to me, Mike, some of the people you hang around, like Bill Craig and Gary Habermas and Craig Keener and Daryl Bach and others, I just wish we could be a fly on the wall and hear your discussion. So my wife said, why don't you start a thing called Fly on the Wall, where you record some of these conversations that you have with these people? Yeah, that's a pretty good idea. So we did that.
Yeah.
We've done it with some few people, and we'll do it with some more. So those are on there. They can check out. So yeah, that's what we have.
Yeah. Well, I wish I had recorded a lot of the conversations I had had with Craig over the years.
Mhm.
That would have been a great book, to conversations with Dr. Blomberg, so that
Yeah.
would be that would have been fun. I never thought about it.
Well, that could be an idea for you right now, for the two of
Yeah,
you to get together for several hours and record it, make transcripts of it, and co-author a book together that way.
that would be great. That would be so much fun.
Yeah.
And it's not too late. And
No,
I
not at
know
all.
I know Craig would enjoy that. And you can be praying for him, because we were going to have lunch on Thursday, and he had to cancel, because of some medical challenges. So
I did
keep him
not
in your
know that.
prayers.
Yeah. I'll
Yeah.
keep him in
So
prayer.
yeah. And so Dale says, thanks, Phil and Mike, for a great show. Really enjoyed this episode. God bless, brothers. God bless, brothers.
Thanks, Dale, and thanks for your ministry, brother.
Yeah. from the shroud guy.
Yeah. And thank you, Phil, for your ministry. I've enjoyed our conversation.
Yep, me too. Great. Looking forward to another one. All
Thanks,
right, we'll
brother.
sign off. And thanks everybody. Thanks for watching. And thank you, Mike, for coming on. And we will see you all next time.